studio at COP28 in Dubai with me, Chiranjib Sengupta. Now, at this beautiful venue in Expo City, Dubai, for the past several days, government and business leaders have been discussing ways to tackle climate change and what it means for the country and company. To shed more light on this, I'm delighted to have with me today Katherine Dixon, partner at Bain and Company, who also leads Bain's Global Energy Transition Policy Center. Thank you, Katherine, for joining us today, and it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And to start off, could you please tell us that why is it so important to accelerate the energy transition now when we are looking at a timeline of 2050?
Right, well, I mean, we're talking about building and completely transforming our energy system. Now, I think when people think about the energy system, they often think about the supply side. They think about, how do we scale renewables, build more windmills, solar farms, and of course that's all really important, but we also have to think about the demand side. We have to think about the industrial sector, the building sector, and all the different sectors of the economy that use energy. So that's a massive change in infrastructure across the entire global economy. So I think we're going to need a few decades to do that. So we better get going.
Right. And of all the announcements, etc., that have come out recently in the past few days here at COP28, what has caught your attention?
Well, look, I'm a diplomat by background, actually.
Yeah.
So, in a way, the COP process is really, really important for agenda setting, right? Without the COP process, we wouldn't have nationally determined contributions. We wouldn't have the ambition that governments have got to transform their economies. But that's not really what drives the energy transition. What drives the energy transition is the industrial policy that countries do at the domestic level and the way that they collaborate, because, of course, sectors of the economy go across borders. They don't end at the nation state. So I find the most interesting things, the things that are going on behind the scenes. It's the conversations between business and government on what they need, what businesses need from government in order to accelerate their own transitions, because it's the interface between business and government where the energy transition happens.
Right. And talking of that intersection, you are one of the co-authors of Bain's Corporate Climate Stocktake 2023. What would you say are the key takeaways from that report?
Yeah, well, this is actually a report by We Mean Business, so we just supported it. But it was an opportunity, I think, in this year of the global stocktake, which is inevitably, it kind of looks backwards. It looks at emissions, it looks at, how countries are doing. Well, the corporate stocktake looks at sectors, which is, as I said, where the energy transition happens. And what we did with We Mean Business is we looked at the frontier companies, right at the ones at the edge of the transition, and ask them, what they're seeing, so that we got a sense of the rate and pace of change and the barriers that they're facing. So the good news is that in every sector, the pace of the transition is accelerating. We're seeing more capital allocated. We're seeing, projects going to FID, and particularly in renewable energy, right? The pace of growth have constantly surpassed people's expectations. But at the same time, there's barriers. So every single sector of the economy is facing a range of transition barriers. And so what the report tries to do is articulate what those barriers are and what businesses need from governments to go faster.
Right. Now, one of the things in which I think the COP28 process is trying to accelerate that is by launching the Global Decarbonization Accelerator, which was announced a few days back. And of course, associated with that, the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter.
Right.
So, where do you see that taking the industry forward?
Yeah, well, this is a great question, because we've seen several incarnations of the same kind of effort, which is, I think, a recognition after many years of COP negotiations that actually the way that you drive transition is through sector-specific action, sector-specific coordination, and not through global agreements at the UN level. So, I'm always going to be excited when the world, starts focusing on the nuts and bolts of transition. And so that, I think, is the ambition of the accelerator, to look sector by sector and try to match up finance, business, and ideally government to drive change. And I think the fact that the MPP, is really driving this, the Mission Possible partnership and Faustine, I think is incredible news, because they really know what they're doing. I guess the one thing I would say as a former diplomat is these, non-state actor efforts are great, but what we really need is governments to relearn the art of multilateralism. What we need are the government initiatives, the government forum, where small groups of governments, those that want to drive the transition faster, coordinate sector level policy, because that's what's really needed. And I think what you're seeing is the frustration of business because they keep, trying to fill that gap. But what we really need is government leadership.
I think it's a very sobering thought and also some great points there. And one of the frustrations is, I think, also about finance, climate finance. And I think recently we saw that there's, of course, trillions being committed, but there's like an $18 trillion gap in climate finance. And what do you think, as a policy, what would you recommend to close that gap?
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing, a lot of people are talking about this, and what you tend to find is people talk about the finance issue. This is not a finance issue. This is an industrial policy issue, as I kind of alluded to earlier. So, you cannot ask companies to invest in the transition absent commercial realities. The transition goes at pace when it makes money, when, the allocation of capital that gets a return, and then it creates that acceleration of investment. So if there's enough capital in the world, but it's not finding its way into the right projects and opportunities. And that's a question of industrial policy. What is the policy, landscape, whether it's in the power sector, the steel sector, the transport sector, that it's going to really enable, businesses to invest at scale, make money, and then reinvest. So we need to stop asking where the money's coming from and ask where the returns are coming from, and for that, it's a policy game. And it's also, it's not a policy game you can do through carbon pricing alone. You have to think sector by sector. What's the transition barrier? Is it, infrastructure? Is it the business model? What is holding back the transition? And then policymakers need to fix it.
Absolutely. And here at COP28, do you think by the end of the summit, you see some of those gaps closing, some of those initiatives being announced? Like, how do you think that this COP is different from the others?
Well, I guess we're getting more specific now, right? We're going behind the scenes of the COP. There's quite a lot of discussions. Like, for example, the cement breakthrough. This is not headline grabbing stuff, but you've got a bunch of countries that are now working together to think, well, actually, what do we need to do to enable the cement sector to transition? Now we're at the foothills of that journey, right? There's a lot that needs to be done, and those countries need to coordinate better. But I would say that we're still missing the real processes and mechanisms that drive that collaboration. If you think, back to the 20th century, we invented all sorts of international institutions to deal with global problems, and yet we come here at COP, the United Nations, to try to solve, emissions in the steel sector, in the cement sector, in the road transport sector. We're not going to do that sat all together with diplomats in a room. We're going to do it through different types of processes and multilateralism. And I still don't think we've got the institutions, that are set up to drive that.
That's a great thought to leave with. And thank you so much, Katherine, for your superb insights on the energy transition. And thank you for taking your time out.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening in. And we will be back with more studio interviews from here at COP28. Until then, goodbye.